Hello, everybody. Thanks for dealing with our wonderful computer acrobats to make sure that this works. I'm using this computer for the first time with GoToWebinar, so I had to kind of go through 1,000 different things to get this to work, but it's working. Let me first break some ice here. So the name of the session was Make Time for Tome. I think that that name is still pretty relevant, but I had talked to Chris Urban, who's one of my good friends, a little earlier to see if he could change the name of the session to Managing Content ... Statically for beginners and site builders. We were going to go over some of the details with Tome. We will definitely still highlight that in this session. However, I figured it'd be good to go over a little more high-level architectural tidbits about the importance of doing a web CMS and potentially linking it up with a static site generator and hosting sites statically. I think the way that we'll get through this is I just have a bunch of slides. Not quite sure that we'll use the whole 45 minutes, but I'll go through the slides with you, express some ideas that I've had, and then at the end we'll have sort of a Q&A, and I'm fairly certain we can unmute and just have questions as we go along. If you can, you could just save them, and at the end there'll be like a little Q&A, and I'll go through it. But it's nice to meet all of you. Let me see if I can go back here. My name is Brian Hasselbeck. I am the Director of Web Experience Architecture at Pfizer. Formerly, I was a Technical Manager of Professional Services at Acquia and promoted there from a Technical Architect at Acquia. Also served as the Manager of Customer Success at Pantheon for a little while, and then came from Apogee. And then I was a web developer at various agencies just sort of earlier in my career. But it's nice to meet you all. I am actually based here in Cincinnati. I have a lot of friends that are in the Philadelphia area, and they asked me to go ahead and put together this deck for everybody. And I figured, you know, it'd be fun to do on a Friday afternoon. Maybe I can take an hour off work and talk a little bit about static sites, which is kind of an interesting thing to me at the moment. Let me see if I can share my webcam so you guys can actually put a face. Hi, how are you? Can you guys still see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so first off, we're going to talk about managing content statically, but before we all do that, let's start with an idea. I have a business, and this business needs a website. What is this business, you say? Well, it's a Nick Cage pillowcase company. I love Nick Cage, not really. And I love pillowcases, not really, but I have a company that is a Nick Cage pillowcase company, and I want to build a website for it. And by the way, this is actually a real thing. You can go to Amazon and order yourself a Nick Cage pillowcase if you would really want that. But moving forward with that, I'm building this Nick Cage pillowcase website. What do I need to do? What makes a good site? What do I need? Well, the obvious requirements are I need a fast site, I need a secure site, the site needs to be somewhat dynamic, it needs to be experiential, it needs to have a decent experience. It's got to be easy to manage and cost effective. These are the pretty obvious requirements that everybody wants for their sites, right? There's not too much difference between this and, say, the most enterprisey of all enterprise sites. But on top of that, I need informational content about the pillows. I need pictures, videos, testimonials, maybe some legal information to make sure that Nick Cage doesn't get upset that I'm selling his image on pillows. Fair use, maybe. Blog, events, FAQs, and maybe I need some about and history about why we have chose to make Nick Cage pillows. But right now, what I don't necessarily need is an API, yet. I don't need a shopping cart because I do most of my sales on Amazon, but I would love to have links that I can share with business contacts and just sort of get my word out there and have a marketing presence of my Nick Cage pillow company. Maybe sometime in the future, we would love to have sort of email subscriptions to this Nick Cage pillow company. Don't know yet, but I don't necessarily need all of that. All I really need is just a ton of content up to help broadcast the marketing message for my Nick Cage pillow company. And obviously, you know, this new business that I've started, I don't really have a huge budget. I don't have anything that I need to sort of put together a massively enterprisey website for this business that I have. So I need to get the website up. What do? I look for the usual suspects in the open source and sometimes not open source community: WordPress, Drupal, Joomla, SharePoint. And after looking through all of these, suddenly I am not excited about building this site. But for the interests of this presentation and talking about sites statically, let's go ahead and choose Drupal for now. And let's persist forward, mainly with Drupal because of a number of different factors. It's open source. It's very community driven. There's a lot of resources, and there's a lot of things that you can do with it. Pro tip: use the tools that are good at the job they are meant to be good at. What does Drupal do well? Well, the reason I would love to use Drupal is because it manages structured content really well. So all of the Nick Cage pillow ideas and taxonomies and everything that I necessarily need to be able to handle and manage content, Drupal does well. And if I want to, I can make a customizable admin experience for the form UI, just using Drupal's backend and maybe just the 7 theme or some other really simplistic theme for the admin experience. And on top of that, just out of box, I can create dynamic views and pages that can house all of my content. And it's really good at processing data. But on top of that, though, what does Drupal not do so well? Well, let me see if I actually missed that slide. Hold on a second. Oh, here we go. Drupal's slow and drudgy under stress without a significant architecture. If I was to have Drupal just straight on a web server and then all of a sudden I had a surge of 1 million hits, people trying to go to my Nick Cage pillow website, I would probably drown simply because Drupal is great at handling and presenting data, but not so well at handling requests at a very basic level. So in order to do that, you need to sort of have something like Varnish on top of that, some sort of caching layer that will allow for content to be kind of statically stored. And I say kinda with emphasis. And on top of that, Drupal needs to be updated to be secure. It needs to continually have updates in terms of its code base.
You don't look too bad. You look a little better, Ellie.
Hey there. I think somebody's not on mute. Ellie, I think we're talking about Ellie.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. So those are what's Drupal good at, what Drupal's not so well at. Well, let's take that into consideration. Let's move on to the next slide here. Okay, so Drupal seems to be the most flexible. But there's more. There's 1,000 ways to build this site, obviously. But we need something that can manage content. Okay, Drupal can do that well. We need something that can be customized easily. Yep, Drupal can do that. I think the form UI, even the theme layer, we can customize relatively easy, and we can put sites up. But I don't really want to deal with risky updates. To update Drupal in production, what? You actually have to update and do database updates and code updates in production. And granted, you know, I've been an architect for, you know, close to a decade now. I've done many of updates, and yes, Drupal handles it well, very gracefully. But you know, why risk it? Especially for something, you know, of this magnitude, my Nick Cage pillow website that's going to have 1 billion users a second coming through. But I also don't want to have a hosting solution that costs a ton. You know, I have to look for a hosting solution that requires PHP, MySQL, and a lot of other technical tidbits. Again, I want to stress that these aren't terrible things. This is sort of the natural life of websites these days. There's inherent risk that comes with having a website, but it would be great to kind of have that out there and I don't have to worry about that. So Can it just be simple, flexible, and not cost an arm and a leg? Yeah, it can. You can manage content with Drupal. You can customize easily with Drupal, and you can make it so it doesn't require risky updates with Drupal because it won't be on production, and it won't cost a ton because we'll actually do static hosting with the module called Tome. Now I can click on this real quick and we'll go through and take a look at this. Tome is a module that's available for Drupal 8. And basically, when enabled, it changes all the site into generic static HTML sites. So basically, it extrapolates a version of your site that you can put up on any sort of hosting platform. And you can even link it and go far enough to have it sort of have a deployment methodology with GitHub and all kinds of fun stuff so that you can directly throw that up. Now, I'm not going to go through the huge tidbits and have a Drupal site already built locally and then install this module and go through all the specifics of that because, to be perfectly honest with you, this is a fairly simple module. And in terms of generating it, it's not incredibly hard to be able to do a lot of the work. I think it's pretty self-explanatory if you have sort of a Drupal-based knowledge and you can enable the module. So what I want to do to take it a little further is talk a little bit more about the architecture level of things, and then have some considerations with it, and then we'll talk a little bit further. So this is what the architecture would ideally look like. On a local space, you would have your computer, which would house Drupal, MySQL, PHP, and all the necessary requirements to house a web application. And on it, you would have your content structure, whether it be a Nick Cage pillow content type or Nick Cage pillow events content type. If I wanted to have all kinds of events related to my Nick Cage pillows, I could go through and create all of the necessary content for that. And I could adjust the form UI. I could go through and make the admin experience wonderful in case I want to hire a content stager or a content editor to be able to go in and create the content for me. And then using the Tome module, it would just be as simple as extracting the content into files. And then because they're all just static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, all derived from Drupal, we could easily lift that to Netlify. You could put it on S3, or you could even put it on GitHub Pages. And the great thing about that is the costs are pennies, especially if you have a lighter site. So what are some other cool solutions that you could do even on top of Tome? And this is part of the reason that I kind of wanted to go a little further than just talking about Tome. Is that, have you ever heard of Jekyll? I'm sure there's a lot of people who have. There's a ton of support for Jekyll in the editor community. It works directly with GitHub Pages, Netlify. You can put it on S3. Basically, any inexpensive hosting that has FTP, Jekyll could work with because all you do is generate static HTML files and put it up, right? But you could also use it with Drupal. What if you could manage content with Drupal? You could go through and actually have the admin experience and form UI and make it easily adjustable inside of Drupal from a managing content standpoint. And then in terms of theming, you could use Jekyll and a little bit of Drupal to be able to generate what the pages would ultimately look like. And in that case, it also doesn't require risky updates with Drupal because it won't be on production. Even Jekyll won't be on production because remember, it just generates HTML static files. And it won't cost a ton because with static hosting, Jekyll will create files for you and you can host it on GitHub Pages or Netlify or anything else for next to pennies. So here's that architecture that I was talking about. Same deal where you would have the local instance where you would have just a local, whether it be VM or some sort of computer that you're running off of that could house MySQL, Drupal, and PHP, and then all of the necessary content structure for that site. You could eventually export all of that content as Markdown in which Jekyll could read and then push up to Netlify, GitHub Pages, and Amazon S3. Not too complex at all. So this is some fairly simple stuff to be able to just house content, manage it effectively, and then get it up to a system that you could actually put up and put on some sort of static hosting solution. But while this is really simple, what about the future? What happens if it needs to be more dynamic? Well, because you've built it already in Drupal, you can use that to be able to move up into a production namespace. So if you do need something that has to have like maybe e-commerce or some sort of shopping cart, or you really want to have a dynamic experience, then if you build it that way, you can ultimately still push that up to production. But you could also make use of microservices. So today there are a ton of open source microservices that you could put on top of a static site. If you want to provide an API to be able to dish your content to other applications, you can do that through a microservice, especially if it's extrapolated through Drupal. You could have a shopping cart, and that means that instead of selling on Amazon, you could sell your Nick Cave pillows on your website using all static files. And the shopping cart microservice could be the provider to be able to allow for that to happen on your static service. And even if you wanted to have email subscriptions, all of it would be readily available from a microservices standpoint. Now, I get what you're saying. This is a very intro, elementary sort of look at how to approach a site build, but I think the premise of this is to consider hosting statically because of performance and security, and kind of not making the web application be your first line against the user to be able to visit, because in this case, you can make a site really, really fast, but you could still make it dynamic having a microservices architecture, but it could still be powered by Drupal. It could still be powered by any other sort of open source content management system. So going back to this is sort of the architecture that I was just describing, where, yeah, now we have some sort of system like Tome that outputs files after the content structure has been created in Drupal. You have Drupal, MySQL, PHP, all of that on your computer. Once that's ready to go and it's staged, you use Tome to export the files, and then that goes to your static file hosting solution, whether it be S3, Netlify, GitHub Pages, or whatever it is. You can have that living. But then using JavaScript, you can have those particular pages have a JSON or Ajaxian API experience with whatever your microservices is, whether it be third party or within Drupal, because you can expose services through JSON API, or you can create custom modules to be able to expose those services. Now, again, this is kind of an elementary way of looking at this. This is very high level, very just quick architecture to explain sort of the benefits of static hosting with content management. So I don't want to go a ton into how you'll create exposed services or configure JSON API or connect with a third-party microservice. I think the importance here is to say that you can host statically and you could still have a well-defined, creative experience that's dynamic, having e-commerce and all of that through static hosting, and having Drupal as a almost pre-production instance that could create content up towards the static hosting solution that you have. So after that, the web has become a microservice platform, and obviously this is not news. This is almost a decade old at the advent of all mobile and all of that. Microservices are easier for mobile applications, so obviously they've become abundant across the internet. I think the internet right now is making, what, 100 billion API calls a minute. But all these microservices are just as open source as Drupal is, whether it be shopping carts, email subscriptions, form handling, image processing, and so much more. It can all be a dynamic experience just simply through a microservice that can be used just with JavaScript. So this is, again, just a consideration. And the example that I have up here, this microservices demo GitHub IO, that's a GitHub page that's statically put up. And this sock shop is an example of a site using an open source cart API to handle purchasing of socks. Obviously, it's an example site, but there's solutions out there that will allow for you to be able to have a really dynamic experience. So marketers are understanding the power of static sites. So as we went through, they're fast. If we just want to be able to put a site up and the user wants to go through it, all they have to do is just load a static file. There's no processing that has to happen from Drupal, and there's no varnished cache layer there that has to capture Drupal and then sort of a bypass through and all this other crazy considerations during deployments and whatnot. It's just as simple as having a static file up. They're obviously secure because you can't hit a processing layer. If you're going straight through a static HTML file, you can't really try to hack PHP or have potential SQL injection or have all these other things because it's just straight static files. They're obviously come to market quickly, so all you need to do to just be able to get files up to the interwebs is just to upload the files. I mean, none of this is groundbreaking stuff. This has all existed in the internet forever, but these are the benefits. And obviously they can be dynamic with a CMS backend. So I know you might be thinking, isn't this starting to look like a file management system where you're using Drupal to kind of hacky put together static files and put it up? Well, the answer is kind of no. The internet loves Drupal because it's finally deconstructed content in a way that can easily detail things. We can go through and really start to take our content and break it down into systems that can be easy to generate and detail aspects of content. You can't really do that with a file management system. It's more of a aggregate and sort of bloaty way of putting a site up. With this sort of approach, you could still think about Drupal as managing your content, but output into something that can ultimately go. So the internet isn't necessarily patient, and static sites can deliver that content fast. So why not make the best of both conventions? Another consideration is, wait, isn't that the point of something like Varnish to pretty much cache the site like static files? Yes, Varnish does cache a site, but it needs to be maintained with a barrage of configuration, whether it be having a VCL file, which opens up certain paths and does not cache other paths, or basically all kinds of rules, whether it be 404 rerouting, 401, 501, all whatever. That all has to be maintained as a layer on top of Drupal, which has cost. And it acts like a proxy that needs to be adjusted for performance and security, like what I was just saying. It adds cost in both time and hardware. And publishing content has to invalidate said cache versus just uploading the changed aspect of the site. And really, I think that I found that that's the biggest winner of static file hosting, is that if you want to update a site that's on a production instance and you want to say change a form element somewhere, in Drupal you'll have to upload all of the configuration for the entire site, run a database update, which will readjust all the configuration. And if you did something wrong, you might break something all the way on the other side of the site that maybe your QA team missed and didn't necessarily account for. So why don't you just have the ability to chunk off that small section of the site and then just simply load the static files to that site, knowing that when you adjust that side of the site, you're not going to break everything else on the East Coast. So the risk for updating production is still there if you use a Varnish cache layer on top of everything. So some statistics that I want to throw out there, and I did get a lot of these from Netlify, by the way. Web performance after going statics have seen an overall 30% improvement. Performance on that means speed of delivery. And if you look at something like a New Relic log or anything along those lines that actually details a request that happens with Drupal, it obviously goes through Varnish, it goes through some sort of Apache layer, it goes through Drupal to be able to define what the page is, has to go back up and cache each one of those layers and go through. 30% improvement is literally speed from server to end user, 30% improvement. Collaboration friction is lessened because aspects of the sites can be changed without affecting unknown areas, like what I was talking about before. And it's easier to hire resources who can help with just HTML, JavaScript, and CSS alongside content entry. Once you get your Drupal form UI set up, then all you need is somebody who can enter content and somebody who can handle HTML, JS, and CSS. And if you go down the Jekyll route, then maybe you'll need some liquid developers. But for the most part, if you can have somebody build a theme, you don't really have much to adjust. So I know that this is very basic. I wanted to keep this entire presentation quasi high level. Is there any Q&A? Is there any questions from this? Is there anything that I can jump in through a little bit more detail? And I guess I'll ask one of the other panelists to see if it's possible to unmute everybody. It looks like we only have 10 people on right now.
Oh, hi, Brian. You have to individually unmute each person. The unmute all button doesn't work, but you do have a question.
Okay.
It's, how does this compare to building the site with something like Gatsby?
Well, I'm not aware of Gatsby. Can
I'm
that
gonna.
panelist? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, you can go ahead.
Sure. Hi there. So Gatsby, I was listening to a previous presentation about it. Gatsby is basically a static site generator powered by React. So you write the site as a React, kind of as a React application. It hits, APIs, or could be Drupal APIs to get the content, but you wind up with static content. So kind of that as an alternative to developing the rendering and all that in Drupal land.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think the comparison what I was talking about is just more that sounds like that would be what Jekyll would probably do from the rendering standpoint. Especially if you're just hitting an API. The architecture that I just threw out there, just kind of playfully, is the ability to just to generate markdown files from Drupal and send that to Jekyll, which Jekyll just simply reads and then outputs as HTML. So it could be something like that.
Gotcha. Thanks.
I would have a question, maybe a naive one, but would it be possible that you mix a static side, static parts of your Drupal site with a dynamic part, so that the traffic intense parts are rendered with Tome, so the performance part is taken care of, and the dynamic parts aren't taken care of with microservices like you described, but instead with a single hosting, simple hosting, I mean.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let me tell you a little bit more about myself. I work at Pfizer. We obviously have been in the Drupal community for quite a while. Won't necessarily go into specifics about what we do from an architecture standpoint, but we have done that, and in that you can actually section off and sort of quarantine certain aspects of the sites that would be totally static. And then all the other dynamic stuff you could still lift and put in front of whether it be certain paths or whatever. And the way that we ideally like to do that, and I have done that in the past, is to manage the way that that's put together from a DNS standpoint and let both endpoints sort of work together, whether it be putting static assets up and then having a Drupal endpoint on top of that, or whatever it is. And you might be able to mesh it up too, so that because the files in Tome, I believe, get outputted to the files directory, you can actually reroute the paths using something like htaccess or something in the Apache layer to make sure that it maps to whatever the output of what Tome does, and then you could still expose the paths inside of Drupal that would be dynamic.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And Brian, are you able to see the next questions from Pierre?
So everybody is having Drupal installed in the local to push changes to production. So no, you can have Drupal installed anywhere. What you could have is a staging URL where basically Drupal could be installed. One could go into it, log in, have the experience, and then output a file. You could put something like maybe some sort of listener that dumps those files to maybe GitHub or something along those lines, and then it'll build from there. So the answer is no, you can have a common URL, it just would not serve as a production URL. And the admin experience would do that there. You'd have to output those files periodically though, maybe on a cron job, which I think you could probably script. Does that answer your question? I think so. Any other questions I could talk about this? Obviously, this is not a one shoe fits all solution. There's 1,000 different ways to build a site, and not all the time is a static site going to be ideal, obviously. But I think if you're going to start up, if you're a mom and pop shop, which I tried to do with by the way, with the look and feel of this, I tried to make it like real farmy. So if you're a mom and pop shop, it might be good to have a static site generator or something like that put up, like if you have a family-owned business or you do something smaller or whatever it is, that might be ideal to do it, but it is still extensible enough to have an enterprise presence. Any other questions from folks? All right, well, it was a real pleasure to chat with each of you. And I guess that's it. If there's no more questions, we can probably go ahead and lop off. that sound good?
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Cheers.